Hey folks, I hope you're doing really well. Today let's talk about the development of horrific visions for World of Warcraft. I had been working on WoW for a while. I'd been focused mostly on the war fronts for a period of time, but I rolled off of that and wanted to spend more time focused on what the major feature would be for patch 8.3. If you're not sure, patch 8.3 is the last patch in a cycle. It comes just before the new expansion launches. So it tends to be something which generally has fewer resources in regards to like team people assigned to it. Most of the team at that point would have been focused on development of the next expansion as they rolled over. So it was an interesting opportunity to explore something new. It was also an interesting chance to I like the whole Nazoth vibe, the horror type thing that goes on in that patch. So I was really attracted to that component as well. So I wanted to explore something. We knew that it needed to be a feature that would persist for a while or be very replayable. I also wanted something which could scale, where it didn't require it to be 5 players and it didn't require it to be 2 players or 3 players. I wanted it to be something that a solo player could engage in all the way up to 5 players, because I felt like that gave it the most variety. Or if you didn't have your friend online that night, then you could still go in and play on your own. I didn't want people to be locked out because of that. I was also exploring a lot of roguelikes at the time. I think Dead Cells was something that I was playing a lot of. And that whole rogue legacy, like there were so many really interesting roguelikes that had come out at that time. So I also wanted to explore the idea of what would a roguelike look like in World of Warcraft. Now we were digging into the Jailer's Tower, but that was for 9.0. I wanted to do a little bit of exploration for a few reasons. One, it sort of interested me. 2, I felt like we could learn something about roguelikes that we could then apply to the Jailer's Tower. And 3, it gave us something that was, again, repeatable and something that we could play again and again and again. Had a lot of interesting design challenges to it. To kick things off, I started just doing some prototyping. The big benefit of working on World of Warcraft is you have all these years worth of assets that you can pull from. And you can just make copies of things and clone things in your own kind of branch, I suppose, of the game, and just start building something without any fear of it being released to the public. So that's what I did. I made a copy of Suramar and had the players starting at a very specific location in Suramar, and then spawned walls that would block off paths so that each time the player joined in or like launched the level, they'd have a different path through Suramar that they had to run through. There's also a number of different dynamic spawns of creatures that you would fight along the way. And then an end boss. And once you defeated the end boss, a portal would spawn. You'd go through the portal and then you'd start over again and again and again and again and repeat and repeat and repeat. It was very intentionally very light and very roughshod. I wanted to try and show that this repeated but dynamic experience of like a different level layout every time and a different spawning sequence of monsters, maybe different types of encounters to fight each time and a different boss to fight each time, could create something like a rift almost from the Diablo experience, the Greater Rifts experience, or something like a roguelike. It wasn't great. I mean, it was fine. It lacked something, that's for sure. It felt like you were just repeating the same thing again and again and again. And yeah, for sure, there wasn't the greater motivation of, why am I doing this? But you could kind of pretend, like imagine if you had that. Even with that, the feeling of going through and fighting these monsters, it just felt very repetitive and it didn't feel like it was going to scale very well. It also didn't really solve the problem of death. You know, like in World of Warcraft, death is very forgiving, especially in a dungeon or especially in a multiplayer kind of group environment. The idea of death in a roguelike is it's meant to be the end of your run. You're meant to have died, you lose everything, and then you respawn. And maybe with some sort of meta progression, you're able to continue and persist. But the reality is you failed. So you need to restart and restart from scratch. And some of the meta is actually in your understanding of how to solve the problem the next time. And it didn't have that. It didn't solve for that problem of death in World of Warcraft. And that was something that I wanted to try and tackle. What happens, or can we have the player lose this roguelike experience, feel like they lost something, and not feel overly punished, but, actually have something that feel like, you've lost, and that's okay, some sort of punishment to it. So we decided to scrap that. It was a month or so's worth of effort in order to build that. It was pretty rough. And I started exploring alternative options. At the same time, I'd been playing a lot of God of War. And if you haven't tried it, there is this experience in the God of War game called Niflheim. Niflheim is sort of a subzone of the greater game. I think it unlocks when you actually finish the game. It is an area that's full of this evil fog that you take damage from whenever you're in the zone. There are creatures that spawn, you kill those creatures, you collect some sort of currency. If you don't make it out of the zone in time before the fog kills you, you die and you lose all that currency. But God of War is God of War. You don't actually lose all of your main character's gear. You do lose the currency that you collected while you're inside of it, though. The only way to save that currency is to be able to exit in time and return to the vendor and spend those currencies, or go back in and do it all again and again and again. There's also an armor that you can use that extends how long you can spend in that evil fog. And I thought this was an interesting concept. You can actually see, if you've played the Horrific Visions, you can already see the overlap. So I started over from scratch. I started by making a copy of Borealis, which was the city in the expansion, then carving out a small section of it and having one single run with a number of spawns in there, and then a boss at the end. It was an area that you could go in. It felt a bit more like World of Warcraft in that you could explore and collect and interact with NPCs. There were still enemies to fight, but it was dungeon-y in that way. And then you actually fought Jaina at the end of it, just because I thought that would be interesting. Throughout the whole experience, there was a bar that gradually went down and down and down over time. That bar was tied to your sanity. Sanity, it was inspired by this very old horror game called Eternal Darkness. In Eternal Darkness, you were exploring this big mansion, and your character would lose their sanity over time based on attacking creatures. And then based on their sanity effect, they would see different things in the house. So if you were very low on sanity, the pictures on the wall would look like horrific, terrible, nightmarish pictures, as opposed to when you were full on sanity, or when you were very healthy, they would look like pretty flower landscapes. Or the less sanity you had, the more you would notice statues start to move. There was this interesting mechanic where every time you went through a door, a different effect would happen. So the door would open, it would close, and then everything would be upside down, or you'd be floating. Or they even played with the meta. They did this thing where they would actually blue screen your PlayStation. Or no, it was a Nintendo. I think it was on Nintendo. They'd blue screen your console, but it was fake. And you'd go and be frustrated and be like, oh man, it blue screened. But then it would actually come back and be like, ha ha ha. So it was inspired a lot by that and the Niflheim. So as you played through it, your madness, your sanity would decrease over time. Just inevitably, you would run out. As you were lower and lower on sanity, eventually you would start getting these sanity effects called madnesses. Those madnesses would be a variety of negative elements. Some of them were cosmetic, such as seeing crazy things. Others were actually functional, like enemies would spawn and attack you, or you would start taking damage. Eventually, when you ran out of full sanity, you would die, and you didn't have an option. There was no way to control that, and you would have to restart from scratch. Throughout the experience, you would collect these currencies, and then that currency could be spent on the tech tree, basically. It was like a talent tree, but specifically to the Horrific Visions itself. This was all done in a prototype, again, in Borealis. And it was very roughshod at first pass. The spawning was very simple. There was no effects. It was all just really again, prototype-y, the way I kind of prefer to prototype, which is just very let's just placeholder it in there and see if we actually have something before we spend too much effort. once we had it in there, it felt like we had something different, but it wasn't really like connecting with the audience very well. So at that point, I decided to layer on a whole just boatload of fantasy. So I went back in and added all the VFX. I added the screen effect whenever you took sanity damage. I redid a bunch of the effect on the creatures, the enemy creatures, so that they actually like applied sanity damage in an interesting way. I also did a bunch of cosmetic spawning to show that this was a horrific vision. This is actually when I first came up with the idea of it being this vision of N'Zoth that N'Zoth had for the future. It's like you were going into his mind basically and seeing what he had planned for different areas of Azeroth. That's kind of when I came up with it. So what I did is I spawned in a bunch of citizens of Borealis and had them trying to escape. The whole scene was meant to be, there's all these refugees that are trying to escape as N'Zoth is invading Borealis. So there was a person like trying to bang down the door and like say, hey, I know you're in there. It's okay, come out. There was someone else talking to their child of like saying, it's okay, just stay quiet, don't make a sound, that sort of thing. Or there are creatures sort of looking for them. Lots of cosmetic spawning just to really reinforce the whole vibe of it. Got some new artwork for the bar as well, for the sanity bar. That's when everything started to really click. When I layered in that level of fantasy behind it. That's what really started to bring the whole experience together. And then when we started playing it on a more like as playtesting, we really started to see the potential for it. And we knew that this was the right direction to chase. So at that point, we added a few more people to the team, all just design. We didn't have a lot of real engineering support. We didn't really need it. We had actually originally planned out, I think it was 4 or 5 different dungeons for the horrific visions. We had one for most of the major cities. We wanted to show the major cities were like the focal points because we wanted to show obviously N'Zoth's effect on all of Azeroth, not just Borealis. Eventually, of course, we ended up with Stormwind and Orgrimmar. I make the mistake pretty often of like over indexing on volume. That was something that I would do, is basically say like, we need all these different things, and the scope of everything got very big, as opposed to focusing down and saying, let's just make this one small thing execute on this one small thing quite well. That's another lesson that I've learned through experience, is rather than trying to promise too much, rather than try and do 5 versions of a dungeon, do 2, do one really, really well. And then you can always do another. But if you don't do 1 or 2 very well, you'll never even get to 5. So our focus to kick off with was, of course, Orgrimmar and Stormwind. We picked out those areas and started laying out where each of the bosses would be. Even though the prototype only had one boss in the form of Jaina, we knew that we wanted the different areas of the dungeon to have tiered up difficulties. In the same way that the Niflheim experience, the deeper that you go, the harder things got. So we wanted to replicate that feeling. It also gave this nice sense of progression. So when you went in, there was a fairly obvious path for you to go. And then once you defeated that first boss, then you could unlock the other areas, as opposed to just being completely open-ended, and then you could go into an area that was too hard and die. The rest of it is pretty straightforward. The rest of the development was relatively like, okay, pretty normal. There was some hiccups, of course, along the way. We had a lot of challenge convincing people that we shouldn't just be using the health bar as opposed to the sanity bar. A lot of the feedback that we got in the playtests was, I don't understand why I need the sanity bar as opposed to just the health bar itself. But I did put my foot down a bit and say, no, we need it because this solves the problem of death. Again, if you're a solo player going into the dungeon without a priest, you would have been, and we were using health, you would have been at a severe disadvantage compared to a player that had a priest or that had a healer class that could go in and just heal themselves, eventually heal themselves through all of the damage, no matter what. By tying it to the sanity bar, which is a brand new mechanic, it had no other abilities that could impact it. There was no way to heal into it. We made sure that nothing that the player could do or cast that you could bring in with you, unless it was very specifically designed, could affect that sanity bar. That way we had very clear tuning and control over it. That also allowed us to say, hey, the player has died here, and take something away from them. Now, we didn't take any of their gear, of course, but we were able to take the coins that they'd collected, or the mementos that they'd collected as they played through it. It also allowed us to do things like specific vials that would restore your sanity, or abilities that would restore your sanity. There was a clear benefit in having multiple players, because if you had other players, yes, you could resurrect each other. We did allow for that. But it still felt fair to the solo player, so that you could still go in there solo and complete it. Was it more efficient to do something as a 5-player, like a multiplayer thing? Yes, of course it was. But that's World of Warcraft. It was always intended. Everything in WoW should, functionally it should, be better if you are playing as a group rather than solo. But I did want to make sure that the solo player could play through it still. And yeah, we managed to add a lot of really interesting gameplay to that, I feel. I think the bosses turned out quite well. I think the overall theme was done and embraced very well by the team. It captures this idea of going into the mind of an old god and seeing the terrible future that he has in store for all of Azeroth if you fail as a champion, which was a nice touch to it. The faceless mask system was probably inspired a bit by Bastion, I guess, where you could customize the difficulty based on what you wanted. Where at the beginning of the run, if you used 3 masks, it would up the difficulty, the baseline difficulty, and then each mask had its own custom effect on it. I think that added a lot of interesting options to the experience. And overall, I'm extremely happy with how it played out. It achieved all of its goals. It was a small team that built it. It was a experience that could be repeated again and again and again. It had enough variety. I do wish we had 3 rather than 2 dungeons, because that probably would have added a little bit more variety, so that rather than cycling back and forth between Stormwind and Orgrimmar each week, you would have been able to go Stormwind, Orgrimmar, I don't know, Undercity or Borealis or whatever throughout the experience, but that's just what we ended up with. And the tech tree itself was good. I feel like, I mean, I can probably get into skill tree a bit more in another video, but I do think that it had enough options there as you were going through the tech tree in order to make it so that you had somewhat something you can tailor it to. It still felt a bit more like an Assassin's Creed type tech tree, where it was like there was some fairly obvious decisions to make as you went through. But it did serve the purpose of giving you the larger intent, like what are you trying to do? And then of course the legendary cloak, which you unlocked and could upgrade by performing the horrific visions. And then that legendary cloak was required, or pretty much required, in order to do the raid for the expansion. For the patch. What did I learn from that? First, prototyping is king. If I hadn't done that first prototype of building out a roguelike in Suramar, I would never have learned the lessons that I needed. And we probably would have built out a lot more, like a much bigger thing, rather than building out this really roughshod prototype and learning, hey, this wasn't going to achieve the goals. 2, avoid overscoping. Again, if you can, try and focus on 1 to 2 things delivered extremely well, as opposed to promising or hoping for 5. And 3, if you have a very strong design instinct and strong reasoning, like good argument for a feature that seems a bit challenging, and you're getting feedback around it which you can defend against, it's okay to stick to your guns. I'm very glad that we stuck with the sanity system, because it did make the entire experience feel very unique. And it also worked really well. It gave the players an extra dimension to focus on while they were inside of it. It was thematically very tied to the overall fantasy of what players were doing when they were in there, or where they were. Yes, you were going insane. You're in the mind of an old god. Of course you're going to lose sanity while you're in there. And there was a lot of really interesting story hooks and mechanic hooks and item hooks that we could put into that played off it really well. So If we had have gone with just health, we wouldn't have had any of that. It wouldn't have felt like such a unique experience. It just would have felt like any other dungeon. So I hope this is interesting. Thanks for letting me ramble, and I'll talk to you again tomorrow.